Welcome, everybody. My name is Larry Kramer. For those who don't know me, I'm President and Vice Chancellor here at LSE, and it's my very special privilege and pleasure to welcome you here tonight for the conversation we're about to have with Baron Peter Piot. So the title of tonight's talk is From Ebola to the Age of Pandemics. And I think there obviously could not be a better person in the world to hear from about this. I'll just do some quick bio stuff. Peter Piot was born in Belgium, went to college planning to be an engineer. Fortunately for the rest of us, he switched to medicine, graduating in 1974 with an MD from the University of Ghent. In 1976, at the ripe age of 27, and while working at the Institute of Tropical Medicine, Peter was part of a team that observed a strange virus in a sample of blood taken from a sick nun working in Zaire. Peter subsequently traveled to Zaire as part of an international commission set up by the government there to help quell the outbreak, which led to the discovery of the Ebola virus. And Peter and his team made, in addition to discovering the virus, key discoveries into how it spread, as well as while they were there traveling from village to village, sharing information and helping put the ill and those who'd come into contact with them into quarantine. So that formative experience then launched a lifetime of groundbreaking work, from pioneering HIV/AIDS research in Africa in the 1980s to serving as the founding executive director of UNAIDS and as UN Undersecretary General, where he transformed the global response to AIDS and brought health to the highest levels of international policy. As former director of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and special advisor on global and European health security to the European Commission President, Peter's witnessed firsthand and been involved firsthand in how health systems have evolved and where they've fallen short. So his experience and insights then span really the full arc of modern global health challenges. So tonight, hopefully, I'm going to poke to get Peter to share some stories from the field, reflect on critical shifts in how the world responds to epidemics and global health challenges, and explore what needs to change as we enter into what he's called an age of pandemics. And the goal is to learn a bit about what lessons from past outbreaks remain unlearned, how we might build health systems resilient enough for tomorrow's threats, and how science and policy can come together to protect humanity's future. So we're going to start with a conversation Peter will have with me. Well, really, it's me asking him questions and getting him to answer. After that, I may offer a few things, but I don't really have anything to offer by comparison, so let's be serious. After that, I'll yield the stage to Professor Alistair Maguire, who's the Kuwait Chair of Health Economics in the Department of Health Policy, and he'll help run a Q&A session with you guys and give everybody a chance to weigh in. Okay, so Peter, you served as special advisor to the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, an LSE alumna, for those who don't know, during what was arguably the greatest public health crisis of our time, our lifetimes. So looking back now, what were the most difficult dilemmas you and the Commission faced in the early months? And maybe, as you talk about how the scientific advisory process was organized and how the science interacted. I'm really curious to hear, especially in Europe compared to the US, how science interacted with political decision-making under the extreme uncertainty.
Yeah, Larry, first of all, it's really great to be here. I was thinking, when was I last time at LSE? And it was in 2008, a long time ago. And when I gave a talk about AIDS, and the title was Revisiting Exceptionalism and pleading for a more multi-sectoral approach, not just medical, the importance not only of economics, political science, legal, etc. In this. And working with Ursula von der Leyen was a fascinating experience. Not only is she an alumna from here, but she's a physician and also has a master's in public health. So very unusual for someone in her position. That made working with her at the technical level much easier than it would have been with someone else. The challenge is that, as you know, the European Union is not a sovereign nation. It's 27 sovereign states, and health is not what's so-called competency of the Union. However, after some hesitations, then when you are faced with such a crisis, yeah, the president of the commission decided to go for it. And the first stuff the things we had to be dealing with were not what I had expected, but it was borders were being closed. Some countries said that you cannot export protective gear to another member state. Others were producing diagnostics and so on. And there is, in theory, free circulation of goods and persons. And that was the first thing I was confronted with, so way beyond my competency and my experience. But that illustrates also that when you deal with a public health crisis, and in the beginning we didn't really fully understand. About exactly 6 years ago, there was the Financial Times is every Saturday's lunch with the FT, and that was with me in there. And the first question of the journalist was, "Why, you're exaggerating, no?" And I said, "I'd rather be accused of exaggerating than not doing my job." And that became the title of the lunch with the FT from then. And so that is then a real dilemma when you don't really know exactly, is this going to become a disaster? And even I underestimate it. Or is this just an outbreak and then in a few months' time it will all be over? And so what was done is that besides dealing with this, free circulation of very essential goods, and that was solved at a political level, purely political level. The question was that we have to deal with, a lot of scientific uncertainty. And the benefit of hindsight, as we know with all the commissions and parliamentary inquiries, it's very easy. But knowing that at that time, we didn't know how exactly is this transmitted, what's the risk, how bad will that be. So what we did, and because your question was on the scientific advice, von der Leyen established a small advisory group with a number of people from within the member states. And we met very regularly. I briefed the College of Commissioners, and I was then based in London. And by the way, I had long COVID and I was recovering from a very bad experience, but still I was doing that. And the briefing the College of Commissioners is like the government, sometimes twice a week, sometimes 3 times a week. And in addition to the scientific advice, I had established a group of an informal forum of all those in charge of COVID in their country, because they were not connected, and in the commission we could not wait until the reports from the various ministries of health came, because it was always at least 2 weeks too late with some. And in addition, this was post-Brexit, let's not forget, because I was based here and I had been living here for at least 10 years and working, we had informal contacts with the UK, with China through conference, and with in the US, but all very informal. So my point would be that you have the formal mechanisms, but the informal contacts are at least as important, sometimes more important. And that means that the best preparation for a crisis and the best resilience is to have systems and contacts in place that you can call upon. If you call someone for the first time when there's a crisis, yeah, maybe you're lucky, but in general that doesn't work. So I think that from about every appreciation, the response in this case of Europe was pretty successful. Big challenge was when a vaccine became available, or we thought would become available. There were some member states who were trying to make bilateral separate deals with the manufacturers, and that basically at the expense of smaller countries. And here also we intervened at the political level and made sure there was a common approach. Now, that has led to some conspiracy theories and people thinking that this was really bad, but I can guarantee you if the original, let's say in this case, the free market would have had its hand, most of the smaller countries, particularly in Eastern and Southern Europe, would have been months and months behind in terms of access to vaccines. And I think that's an example of success of the value added of joint action and also of taking into consideration the interest of, every single, in this case, member state.
And just say a bit more, I am curious, how much of that was through the informal contacts versus formal process? I mean, sort of any good illustrations of...
Yeah, well, it was always both. But let's say you need a formal process also in terms of impact on policy. One of the challenges was that the response in different member states was very different or not or aligned. And okay, I live now in Brussels, and for example, at some point, the Netherlands had put in place a curfew, and but in Belgium was not the case. So what happens that the Dutch would come to Antwerp to party, and then at some point it was the other way around between France and Belgium and so on, and that's and that we never really could resolve because there were national interests, and then there were still unresolved debates about, for example, what to do with schools. That's still unresolved. We probably acted there retrospectively, but that was the way. But it was we also had several regularly and organized that contacts. It was all, for me, what was new also was all by Zoom and team meetings. Without that, I'm not sure how we would have organized that. You remember the time when we had to go to a place to see someone. So that technological development helped us a lot, but also with CEOs of all the companies that were developing vaccines, and with some of the scientists, and that was also very helpful at a time when it was not 100% sure, will we ever have a vaccine? And planning for that. And what's also, I would say, I'm proud of, but it didn't work out very well, but at the same time, before there was a vaccine available, we also launched COVAX. This is an initiative to make sure that there would be access to a potential vaccine or a hypothetical vaccine for low-income countries. But at the end of the day, everybody, when you're a president or prime minister, your first job is to deal with your own citizens.
Yeah, thank you. So while we're on the pandemic, I guess the WHO pandemic agreement was adopted about a year ago. And that was after years of negotiations. And as I understand it, at least, is only the second time a legally binding treaty has been agreed to in the WHO's history. And I gather some of it's also still being negotiated now.
Yes.
So maybe just say a little bit, is it a good agreement? Is it enough? Does it have real teeth? Is it just another one of those aspirational agreements that, sort of offer a feel-good solution but won't really actually change anything? Sort of what's your perspective on the whole effort?
I think it's all of the above, as you say, in the sense that I'm definitely in favor of international agreements and the rule of law and so on. So there's no doubt about it, and it's better to have that agreement. The conversation is still on, and it's about rights and sharing information and so on. But there's a lot of hypocrisy going on there. There are many African states that have signed an agreement with the US government, which gives them 25 years access to all the data and so on, and exclusively to the US government. And in Geneva, the same countries will say that they're in favor of a full sharing of all the information and without limits and so on. And then on the same thing, at the European countries are also speaking with a forked tongue. And how to say this, I think that one thing I learned, and that was when India was very badly hit by COVID and killing literally millions of people. And there was a shortage of oxygen and vaccines and so on. And Prime Minister Modi banned the export of vaccines to other countries. And first I was very upset, and then I thought what I always do, and this is something that I learned from my mentor, Stanley Falco, someone we know, and he said, how would you be yourself? Put your head, in the other person. In this case, for my thesis was in the micro, but here, if I were Prime Minister of India, which will never be the case, of course, but I said I would have done the same thing. I'm elected by Indians, not by Africans or people from other countries. And at the end of the day, regardless of international treaties, that will always be the case. But in order to protect as many people as possible in an equitable way, these kind of international treaties are important. But we should also be realistic what it means. I mean, I'm not a legal academic as you are, but we see that the interest of the country, the sovereign interest, will then prevail. But that, how to say, international treaties can keep that maybe a bit more under control. But let's not forget that scarcity is the enemy of equity. When something is very rare, then, and it's life-saving, regardless of international treaties. So I think the other treaty has really had a good impact, the Tobacco Convention on Tobacco Control. But that is, how to say, I think is a very different nature of that. So I'm definitely in favor of it, but I also think we should not expect that thanks to that we're going to solve all the problems.
Mm-hmm. Let's take a moment, or stay for a moment on the kind of larger global health architecture, which obviously has been one of the central efforts in your life. I know you recently wrote an article about this. And I know you're a fan of kind of drastic reform. So, give us a kind of candid assessment about the current state of the global health government system, why it's, I gather, in your view, not fit for purpose. And then we can talk a little bit about what might be needed.
Yeah, and before that, one thing I forgot to mention, that is that as I'm, in favor, but at the same time skeptical about treaties, is that for me, the main conclusion of this event, let's say, with India, was that there's only one solution. And that is that countries that at the moment are in a position that they don't have access to life-saving commodities, the way to do is to make sure there is manufacturing in these countries. That is for me. And then these treaties are less necessary. And that's why I became a big fan and also helped finding funding to promote investments in manufacturing, particularly in Africa, because the rest of the world is pretty much covered by it. So just wanted to say that. So I always try to find structural solutions that don't depend on the whims of the day of whoever is in power, that we have institutions, we have structures. Now, the global health system and the global international system in general is no longer fit for purpose. I think we need to recognize that. And we've been realizing that partly through COVID, but particularly through the recent massive decline in international development funding. And this is not only the US, but also the UK, most European countries, driven either by war efforts, defense, or by ideology. So that has made this a true crisis. And funding for, be it WHO, but the Global Fund, just name it, all these institutions has gone down in sometimes a dramatic way. But my point is that even without that crisis, the time was there to repair it. On the positive side, let's not forget that these institutions, except for a World Health Organization, has always been there and will always, not always, but since after World War II, and will always be needed. But all the other institutions were set up around the millennium, were developed. And I'm co-guilty to create some of them to, with this plethora of institutions. And that was driven by a few factors. One, a great interest in global development and the realization that the health and well-being of people thousands of kilometers from us can affect us, so it's in our own interest. There was the AIDS epidemic, which was driving a lot of the solidarity and the realization that there is some global thing. There was also, economically, we were in good shape, and there was money available for international development. But then the condition was that in parliaments or politically from donor countries, we want specific mechanisms that can deliver. And I represented Kofi Annan, who was then the UN Secretary General, in the negotiations that led to the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, malaria, which is the biggest of all these institutions. And my number one, instruction was, this cannot be part of the UN system. And that came from the Secretary General of the UN. All my colleagues in the UN, they were very upset with me, but that was not negotiable, because he said the UN system cannot deliver that. We need something that's more business-like, that can deliver, that can, for procurement and all that. And so, and I think that the last 25 years have seen spectacular progress in many of the health outcomes. When you consider that in more than, about 20 years' time, that the mortality, that today less than 50% of children under 5 die than in 2000. And in the meantime, the world population has increased by about 30%. So that is a spectacular, measurable impact. HIV, TB, with this many examples. Maternal mortality, not doing so well, but anyway. And that's due to a combination of domestic investments. Let's not forget that. It's not all international. But also, for these issues, this international funding. And I'm afraid that now it was a historic anomaly of 25 years. When you see the funding, it's like we had a plateau, and with COVID it went a bit up, but then it started already going down. And now the question is, where will this plateau land? Will it be at, let's say, 10,000 meters or 5,000 or 2,000, whatever, in terms of, the money, in terms of billions? And I think that now we also have a new situation in the sense that there were also negative side effects, like for everything. Yeah, even an aspirin you can die from, but also the national development. One, the priorities were those of the donor countries, basically, and of global, not necessarily of the countries the low-income countries. Two, there was very specific, some people call it vertical programs, and they did not lead to strengthening, in this case for health, the health systems. Sometimes even you could argue undermining. And three, it created some donor dependency. And also, if I were a minister of finance and you see that some foreign funding or whatever will fund my whatever, health things, why would I spend my money? The demands are so enormous. So it led to a decline in investment. And four, it was also undermining sometimes local capacity. A lot was in control of intermediaries, American, British, etc., universities and so on. So the efficiency was not so great. So there is a call now for greater efficiency. There's also, let's not forget, there is competency, talent, and centers of excellence in about all countries. If you accept some of the countries that are in permanent crisis and humanitarian crisis, okay, that's different. But the majority now, they have centers of excellence. And partly because there have been these investments. And I think with the current crisis has led to a real movement for, some call it sovereignty or whatever. They want to really rethink how it's done. And there are a few points, and I'm involved with the Accra Reset Initiative, which is an initiative that was launched by President Mahama from Ghana. And there is a presidential council, and the president of Nigeria and Kenya and others, and Brazil and Indonesia are part of it. And their mission is they want to change and reform, reset the world order, basically. Very ambitious. We'll see how it can work. And for my sins, I'm co-chair of a high-level panel on health. And so that we're focusing on financing and domestic financing, but also what's the value added of this international funding. It's not normal that, for example, the US PEPFAR, they were paying tens of thousands of nurses in Africa to deliver healthcare. You can argue that's not the real value added of international funding. But there is bring in innovation, market shaping, and so on. So there are many aspects of it. And I think that it's going to be very difficult to change anything, to reform. I don't know a single example of a multilateral institution that spontaneously has closed itself or that down. And yet there are simply far too many institutions, and together with my colleagues and friends, Mohamed Pate, who is the coordinating Minister of Health and Welfare in Nigeria, and Donald Kaberuka, who was the President of the African Development Bank, we've been calling for some radical reforms, for mergers and acquisitions, to use the business term, creating some holding companies, and it's a combination of efficiency gains, but also being far better purpose for the health of people, because, and then I'll stop here, but one of the big problems is that a country like Malawi, for example, has to deal with over 30 different donors in the health sphere. Each of them have their own forms, budget cycle, monitoring evaluation, consultants, just name it. And the burden that puts on countries that have already are struggling with their own resources and human resources is enormous. So trying to bring that all together, but I think I'm optimistic because thanks to a crisis, we may be able to at least do some reform.
I will say the problem of multiple donors has been around forever.
Yes.
There's no reason it can't be solved, and yet it continues to go unsolved because the donors are just so unwilling to give up their, and it is, as a former donor, just a completely bizarre fact of life.
And they speak with a forked tongue. Eh? They say
all.
the right thing, not all, but certainly I would say,
but yeah.
No, some not. US donor doesn't speak with a forked tongue, that's clear. European donors are, country ownership and all that, but then on my conditions.
Yeah.
So,
say a bit more, you talked about mergers and acquisitions. Like what kind of merge, who's merging, who's acquiring whom? What are you thinking about? I mean, is that private sector stuff that would be forced by governments, or you thinking about public interest organizations?
Yeah, we've been thinking, I mean, there's no magic formula. The paper we published was the purpose was really to create a debate by being rather more concrete than many of the other academic papers where we're all brothers and sisters, we're going to work together and we have an ideal system in the world. That's not going to happen. So we make a distinction, and again, coming back to the health sphere, you have WHO, that's an entity, if it would not exist, it would have to be reinvented. I mean, we need a normative institution that brings together, that is convening role, etc. So for the world, and that's not influenced by national or a commercial interest. I mean, that's the theory, and I think that's always needed. It has to go through, for me, we can come back to that, to some profound reorganization and refocus, but it's the others, like we have, you have different typologies. You have financing instruments. On the one hand, you've got the multilateral development banks, now with the World Bank and the regional ones and so on. And there are lots of discussions how they should be organized and what, and etc. So that's one area. I'm not suggesting they should be merged or whatever. I think it's good to have regional entities and so on, but it's the way they're working. It's not very efficient anymore. But secondly is the financing funds, like Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, Malaria, Gavi, the Pandemic Fund, UNAIDS. These are financing mechanisms that have all really made a huge difference, but all of them have seen their assets reduced in a big way. And I think that's only the beginning. And they work with so-called replenishments every X years, depending on it. And this year it could have been worse, but I think in 3-4 years it will be worse. So there are reasons for efficiency that you can. What we call for is a holding company where you could have one board, one back office, one set of procedures, one cycle of of monitoring, evaluation, and so on, and but then separate company, because the vaccine folks is a bit different technically than others. So something along these lines. And I think because they're multilaterals, in theory that should be possible. The question is, is there appetite? Because the boards are, how to say this, there's so much, the point of departure of the discussions is the interest of the organization. And what we put in our paper is also the starting point is what is needed in countries and what will produce the best impact and outcomes. And it's a quite different thing but it's not that easy. And then you have a multitude of so-called product development partnerships. Again, they've added value, but most of them are too small to produce really a product. And again, some of them are in palliative care, I would say, to use a medical term, but they're all surviving. And so there would be, again, one could create the biggest one is, and that is doing pretty well, I think, is CEPI, Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation. And why not, bring them all together? The risk, of course, is that you create even worse bureaucracy if it is bigger. So it's a combination of things. And then the disease-specific entities, I think for advocacy, fine, but I think the time is gone. When I started with UNAIDS, I always had a sunset clause in my mind. I didn't think, and I think that should be compulsory for any organization that is set up and that's new. The key in the case of UNAIDS is civil society. How can one provide a forum for advocacy, civil society, because no UN system organization is really, let's say, open to that. But I think what the counterfactual of not doing anything and to stay with everything will be much worse off, and will be much worse off for the results, and will be an enormous waste of money. We keep the golden cages in New York and in Geneva and so on, and not thinking of the interest of people on the ground.
Yeah. By the way, I want to say a word about treaties, just for everybody else, which is just because the way we talked about, there's two extreme positions that are just not accurate, right? One would be that treaties are ignored and just a matter of complete national interest.
No.
The other is that treaties are actually going to operate and people are just going to comply with them. Any more than ordinary law, that's really not how it works with people. So when you think about treaties, the advantages that they provide are essentially twofold. One is they do create a norm.
Yeah.
If you signed onto it, that makes it harder just to depart on national interest. And if you signed, it's always because you did see something in your national interest. And then the other is their key coordinating mechanisms. So they really do play a significant role. If the pressures get high, people are obviously going to abandon them, as we violate the ordinary law when pressures get high in our own countries. It's really very much the same thing.
It's a better summary of how I see things, but absolutely.
I used to write about that. The law and society, law is not a separate thing from society, it's part of it. So it's another social norm in a manner. I want to, though, let's come back to the WHO for a bit and the whole funding question. So the US is withdrawn, other governments are reducing aid, so it's not just an American phenomenon. I guess in some ways the question, should we just get rid of it and start something new? Or, is it going to survive? If it survives, in what form should we try and keep it and then reform it? That's been such a pivotal organization for so long. So it's going through a kind of convulsive challenge. And what should we do with it in particular for a moment?
Yeah, that could be a conversation in its own right. But I think that my view is that it should always exist. We need that as one intergovernmental institution that can also set norms and standards, and we will need that. And I think, let's assume again the counterfactual, you destroy it and then you start anew. I think it'll be not that very different. The challenge for governance is always that it's an intergovernmental organization. In other words, everybody is in there in the world. And you bring in there in the same body, until recently, the US and China and, and oh yes, that's, I'll come back to that. And all the the conflicts and so on. And there are some people in health who say, oh, this should not be, politics should not be in there. That's naive. I mean, it's about, you know, even if technical expertise and you know, integrity should be how to say, that's a source of credibility, but you can't, we live in a world that's, yeah, has all these things. But so I think it's, and I've also written about this with some people, in that it's a matter of refocus. And it's a bit, again, the result of same member states even don't say, oh, WHO must focus, and then at the same time they say, oh, but now you should take on that issue, and then you should take on that issue. And so that's, if I were Director General of WHO, I was thinking, oh, how do you manage that? But it is really a matter of refocus, and what we say, what nobody else can do, is be the global reference for norms and standards, sometimes treaties, or softer, you know, versions of them, and both at the technical level, but also at the policy level. Be the convener where everybody comes together. I think it's still better to be together and maybe waste a lot of time, but then than to shoot at each other. So we have to talk to each other, and in the health field, and also providing, you know, support for those countries that are, you know, in difficulty. But again, it has to start. For example, in the pandemic front or epidemics, after the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, when WHO was heavily criticized because it took about 4 or 5 months to declare that this was a public health emergency of international concern, and it was really terrible failure of WHO. It went the other extreme and became an organization that intervened and that is going to supply chains for all things that, frankly, are not in the DNA of WHO. And there are others, a UNICEF or a World Food Program, they're much better than that. So there's been a real mission creep in a big way. So I think that that's something where now with the, what is it, 40% reduction of the budget, the key question for me is how to refocus and not just reduce everywhere a little bit and then try to do the same with less. That's not going to work. And ultimately, WHO should be able to do its job with actually a smaller budget, but that is not earmarked. In essence, if you deal with norms and standards and that role, you know, that should not be influenced by any commercial and philanthropic or national interests. And that should come from the core budget, as it's called, unearmarked funding. And then, like, they have, like in a country like Nigeria, WHO has a subnational, a state office in every state of Nigeria. I don't know how many there are. These days are over, you know. It was set up at a time when there was not much expertise in many of the countries. Today, take a country like Nigeria, I mean, they have the talent and everything that's sometimes superior than the people who work in these organizations that are telling them what's good for them. So that, and I think we're now at a point where a new Director General will be appointed and so on, and I think that's an opportunity for some refocus of both in terms of management, for example, also human resource management. This should be true performance management with consequences. And I think ultimately I hope that the US will go back, because US is such a force in terms of innovation, of expertise, of policy, that we can't do without. And that will be also a job maybe for the next either Director General or President for doing it. But it's a big loss for the organization. But this is now a time to rebalance, perhaps. Then there are other unresolved questions. WHO is also quite unique with strong or weak, but regional offices that are politically strong, and sometimes technically also, or sometimes technically very weak. And that's, yeah, and I don't have an answer to that question, I must say.
So it does raise an interesting. By the way, I wouldn't hold my breath on the U.S. going back, even with the new president. No, I think what's broken there is probably broken for the long run, at least in this space, because there was never much support in the American public.
No, that's true.
So,
yeah, good point.
So here, I guess I recently joined, for better or worse, the board of the One campaign, and there's an internal conversation going on there around this question, which is whether, with the decrease of aid, should the effort be to restore it, get the developed nations to go back to giving more resources, or if there's going to be reforms, to what extent should those countries be able then to drive those reforms as a possible condition for the restoring money, or should the reform be driven by the developing countries, who are the countries where the issues are most pronounced, or should we write off the global effort altogether and just focus on helping countries with their own resources manage their problems? So tell me what should I take? By the way, I joined the board because I thought, from the experience I'd had before, I might have something to offer them in helping think these through, and I'm instead finding myself, these are very difficult questions. So
I think it's great you joined that board, and I think that what we need at the moment is people who come from outside our field and who come with different perspectives from different disciplines, different experiences, because we're a bit stuck with the current models. And the questions you ask, I think the first thing is to ask the right questions and see what are the the scenarios. As I mentioned, I'm involved in an initiative, this Accra Reset, which is driven by the Global North. And what's interesting, it started in Ghana as an African initiative. And there, that was in August, and there several people, and that was led by Minister Mohamed Pate. He said, no, we can't do that just with Africa. We need to also look broader and go with the Global South. And then Brazil and some Latin American and some Asian countries joined, and India and so on. And then we got together, and that's how I got involved. And then they said, but we can't do that without having a dialogue also from where the money is, and they're contributing. And so it becomes more difficult to manage on the one hand, but if just one part comes up with something that may create so many antibodies, that it's not going to work. But how to do it different? I also sometimes think that what is the future of global entities? Will it be a confederation of regional initiatives, or is it a global thing with some regional subsidiaries or whatever? I don't have an answer to it, but I think that this is the time for an institution also like LSE to contribute to the thinking of that. And this is not only an academic issue, but what are the scenarios, testing them out, and then we need this dialogue. But in the past it was nearly always it was all dominated by, let's say, Western powers, Japan, Australia, and that's it. And today that's no longer, I think, acceptable to have something that will be beneficial for the people on the ground. And that, for me, is a starting point.
And so where does the aid fit in there?
Yeah, and that, I think, is a very important question. This is something that we are working on, we being with this Accra Reset and a number of, like the Center for Global Development in Washington and so on, is to see what's the value added of international funding and aid. And that also needs some good thinking. It's up to now we had, in a sense, the luxury of also providing support for recurrent costs and all that. And I think even when I gave my talk here, I showed a slide where that showed the percentage of people on antiretroviral therapy, so people with HIV, with life-saving therapy in a number of African countries, the percentage that paid by foreign aid. In some countries it was 90%. And my question was, can a state call itself sovereign if the survival of hundreds of thousands of citizens depend on a vote in US Congress or in Parliament here or whatever? So we have to look at that, and I think that there is it cannot work if there is not an increase, I'm talking about health now, of domestic funding, that's for sure. But also it's not only raising the money, but allocating it properly, spending it and spending it well. So it's a lot of work for folks like you here to help defining that. But I think that the value added, as I call it, of international funding is particularly in the outside humanitarian crisis, because I think that is a separate area. We should also not neglect, and that has been suffering a lot at the moment from this decline. But it is like innovation, introducing innovation, market shaping for products and all that. For example, the value added of agave has been that the price at which a country can buy vaccines is much lower than if it would negotiate itself, purely because of volume and of, that kind of thing is clearly value added. But that's a kind of, I would say, a kind of research that we have to do, and that's the one point. And then the next question is, and how to deliver that, the what and the how.
Yeah. So it's 2026, and you can't have a conversation about anything, but probably perhaps particularly health, without talking about AI. So let's talk a little bit about artificial intelligence and what role you think it's going to play in changing this, helping it, hurting it. What are the upsides? What are the downsides? What do we do to capture the first and avoid the second, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, let's limit it to, let's say, the global health sphere, because
in the global health field, yes. Sorry, I meant in the global health field.
It's yeah.
Or in the health field.
Yeah,
well,
in the health. Yeah, health in. Okay, I would say that the good news is that I think it can play quite a role in decreasing the problem in some problems, like human resources in health are a big issue. And with AI, I think that if it's adopted to the context, because one thing we shouldn't forget is that, for example, large language models are being trained on data from where? From US, within Europe, and so on. And it may not be completely relevant if you use it in Tanzania or whatever, So there is a need for investments in having AI that is generated by data for the populations we work on. And for me, that's a big issue. But it can go to helping understaffed institutions, particularly at hospital levels, for better diagnosis, for imaging. I mean, there is a revolution going on when I see when you go to China what they're using, AI with mobile phones for just name it. I mean, that I think can be like the leapfrogging certain things. I mean, it reminds me of the mobile phone. I used to live in countries in Africa. We had to order a phone call for an international call, and it would take, etc. When this was in the last century, and now everybody, the number of mobile phones per capita is more than one per capita in most countries, and but there's still no landline that's functional. But what was the first country in the world that on a large scale introduced payments by phone? It was Kenya. It was with M-Pesa. So you can have local initiatives that are grounded in local. I'm an optimist, and I know personally a few people who used to work at Google, Africans, now have started and Indians start their own company. And like in Senegal, for example, this is called Vera. So there with regular phones, they developed a system driven by AI for pharmaceuticals, for payment, in pharmacies, and so on. And they have at the same time, and it's in 2 years' time, 3 years' time, they're already making profit because they start from nothing. And the additional benefit is that now suddenly they have data about all kinds of things. So I think there is going to be a positive impact. The negative side is that we're already seeing it, is that misinformation, disinformation, which is becoming one of the big epidemics, if not a pandemic of our time, are being accelerated. You have chat boxes, so you have, there was in Burkina Faso, there was a demonstration project introducing genetically modified mosquitoes to control malaria transmission. Okay, it was stopped because social media and blogs were spreading that this Bill Gates is going to sterilize our daughters. Okay, and that could have happened without AI, but it's been accelerated. But I think that the key will be that we have systems that are adapted and that are not necessarily the big ones, because one of the problems is power, energy. Where is that going to come in countries that have already are struggling with electricity, water, all that? So this is where I'm very intrigued by what's going on in China when you see that DeepSeek apparently has less requirements, but it's not my field. But I'm, what strikes me also is that there's a whole new generation of young Africans, and they're playing with it and so on. But there's not this power of the OpenAI and Anthropic and Microsoft and Google and so on behind it. So So
let me ask a follow-up on that then. Although on the power question, just for actually everybody to know, there's some recent research done here by Nick Stern and others at the School of Sustainability, which shows that the energy savings that AI will produce by increased efficiency that it can capture in just cars, agriculture, and electricity generation is 4 to 5 times as much as the total use of energy by AI globally.
Oh, that's good news. Is that published? So anyway.
It's in Nature magazine recently, the most recent issue.
I read Nature, but
okay. And that's just across those 3 sectors. So,
okay.
I mean, it doesn't mean we don't want to find ways to have AI use less energy as we
no,
the benefits far away. But the last point you touched on, though, does get to, it seems to be the question, and the first point, which is, so you're going to need to have your own LLMs.
Yes.
You're going to need to have them trained on the information about your own populations, which means you're going to need your own data centers and all of that. And that's vastly expensive. So it comes back sort of the aid question, which is, I'm sure some of these countries obviously may be perfectly capable, but it's going to be another place in which the developing world will be either beholden to the developed world for either the technology or the money or both. It seems to me that's a pretty big question.
That's a very good question, and for me that would be one of the areas for added value of international development, and also collaboration, thinking as an academic institution, and since I used to lead the London School, the others, Hygiene, Tropical Medicine, investing in that's going to be far more important. And also the value chain, starting from innovation to manufacturing to access, how to do without, it's through partnerships, and that will benefit everybody.
I mean, it's a downside of the model that we currently have, which treats AI as a private good to be developed and grown through private markets instead of as a utility, for instance, like we do the internet. Okay, 2 questions at the end, my 2 favorite ones. So I'm just going to read this one. Peter, you co-discovered the Ebola virus nearly 50 years ago, led the global AIDS response through UNAIDS, advised the European Commission during COVID-19, and now are working to reshape the global health governance for a new era. Looking back over this career, what has been your most important lesson about how the world mobilizes or fails to mobilize against health threats?
Yeah, that's a tough question because I never stood still and just go for it. But anyway, one, I think that often it's crises that lead to change and that to mobilization. And when you look at the global health movement, global health is a word that you can't find last century. It appeared only around 99 and 2000. And it was driven by the AIDS epidemic. And luckily, if I may say so, HIV was affecting both high-income and lower-income countries. It was not just that, which was then also an incentive for pharma to invest in it. That's where the drugs came. If this would have been like malaria only in the tropical countries, we would not have had that. And that led to at the same time around the millennium, we had the development, the Millennium Development Goals in these days. And then we had leadership also with Kofi Annan, I think was really very much of a leader, bring together everybody. So I think this crisis, and now we have a crisis that is going the other direction, but I think for reform, but really that brought it. Second thing is that, tell you an anecdote. So I started with UNAIDS in 95, and by 98, after 3 years, and I thought in 5 years we're going to do the job, or in 10 years, and then close down, and I said that. And after 3 years, no progress. More people were dying, and that was the only thing I really cared about, how many people are dying. That's, so what did I do? I said I'm a total failure. And yeah, I can sometimes be hard on myself, but you have to do that. And I called a non-meeting, as they say in diplomatic circles, and that was before social media, no phones, no nothing, of people who were, let's say, friends and people who were very critical. And I put it on the table. I said, we failed, what should we do? And 2 days was pretty hard for me, high risk also. But the conclusion was extremely important for me. The conclusion was there are only 2 things at the end of the day that matter, and that is the economy and its security. And we need to redefine the whole thing, and because the economy, it's not only about the money, but also people's condition, economy and political economy in the broad sense of the word, and then security, because if something is a security issue, budgets are there, as we see today. And so we redefined, so what did I do then? Okay, I said, I have to go. We brought it to the UN Security Council, because that's the only one that really has power and about war and peace and so on. And on the economic terms, instead of talking to ministers of health, I went to the economic commissions, tried to convince the World Bank, go to the World Economic Forum and all that, where in these days, I was the only health person that you could think of. And they asked me, what the hell are you doing here? And so that redefining was, for me, was very important, and it brought it to, and then also we created the Global Business Coalition on AIDS. So bring in big business, which I was, by my progressive friends, thought I was on the payroll of that, and that was very bad. And I said, we need them all on board, and we need products that can be given to, to save lives. And then I would say it is ultimately a political issue. But our role can be to provide and develop strong business case that's built on evidence. And with the 2 legs that I always try to walk on was, the one hand, the science, the evidence, and on the other hand, equity and the respect for human rights, and making sure that as many people as possible can benefit from what we do. Yeah. But that combination, if you walk on one leg, I mean, it's possible, but I don't think you can be as effective as impact.
Okay, last question. So we have an audience here of many students, undergraduate, postgraduate, PhD students, et cetera, who are looking towards a career in the same fields you've been in. I dare say most of them would love to have a career like yours. But they're entering at a time of shrinking funding, rising nationalism, the collapse of the multilateral order. So having spent your career at the intersection of science and politics and diplomacy, what one piece of advice would you give them?
Well, first I'd like to say when I started my career, you mentioned Ebola, so the 76, so in 74, global health did not exist. I mean, there was tropical medicine, it was still very post-colonial, neo-colonial, so it was not, and there was also not, it was not where the smartest medical students would go into, or public health or laboratory. So my first thing is always make sure, follow your passion rather than what you think the market is going to tell you. That's really key for me. But what's most important is, I think, that you acquire expertise in a particular field. And in global health, we need as much legal, experts, people in economists, social scientists, business people, microbiologists. So we need, what I'm saying here, I'm not saying that because I'm at LSE, but I've said that everywhere. And it's not always popular in the classic public health field, but that's what we need. And I think that's what we can, without that expertise, you can't make it. The days are gone. When I was very young, when I went in Ebola, I had never been to Africa. I had no clue what I was doing. There was never experienced the epidemic. And yet I could go because nobody else was interested. And in today's world, it would be impossible. I don't tick all the boxes. But today you need that expertise. It could be AI, or computing or whatever. So that's really important. And then I think, don't give up, and for the first time that it doesn't work, so that's why the title of my book is No Time to Lose. This is my memoir, which is already 10 years old, but and that is that on the one hand, you need to have patience and to always never give up, but on the other hand, no time to lose when there's an opportunity. And I'm giving regularly commencement speeches, if so, it goes whether you're getting old. And I always say, people, don't plan too much of your life. Don't overplan, but don't miss the opportunities and take some risks and, but make sure that you are really good at whatever you're passionate about.
Thank you. That's fabulous advice. So listen, my schedule Peter knows this, got complicated for some reason. They scheduled a dinner at my home that I'm host of. But I so wanted to do this that I came, even though I'm now going to be about a half hour late to my own dinner. So I'm going to turn it over to Alistair McGuire, who will handle the Q&A and give you all a chance to do this. But as I leave, I just want to say thank you. That was really wonderful and really a privilege and an honor for us.
See you later.
Thanks, Larry, very much for kick-starting us. Now it's your turn. I just want to ask you, if you are going to ask Peter a question, just say who you are and a little bit of your background before the question. So, as I say, it's over to you. It's your turn. If there's anybody who wants to ask Peter any question. There's somebody at the back there, Peter. I think maybe the mic's on I don't know, is it all roving mics? Is the mics on the desk don't work?
Does this work? Yeah. So thank you very much for the talk. Very important and very insightful. So my name is Daniele. I'm a PhD student here in the Department of Health Policy at LSE, and I work on vaccine hesitancy based kind of like with a political heterogeneity at its core. I mean, my question is, you briefly touched upon it when we were talking about AI, but you call it the kind of age of pandemics. I would argue that we're also in an age of misinformation. And from a political standpoint, on all of the talks that we talk about when we're talking about health politics, governance in the global health sphere, are very high level, kind of academic driven, government driven talks, which oftentimes are kind of disconnected from the average person who is not very educated or interested in these topics. So from a misinformation point of view, what are some of the risks and what can we do to kind of bridge that gap between, the average person who is more prone to misinformation with, AI and social media, and these kind of high-level discussions that we see in academia and in the governments that are not often resonating with the average person? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's an issue close to my heart, and I said that I think one of the biggest pandemics at the moment is misinformation, disinformation, and all that. Now, there is a person in this room who's much better placed than I am. This is to be my wife, Heidi Larsson, Professor Heidi Larsson, who is the authority, I would say, on vaccine hesitancy and all that. And maybe can I ask Heidi, do you want to? Can I put you on the spot? I can give an answer, but it's what I hear from Heidi. So yeah, maybe
I'd like to hear more about your work at some point, but
can you keep it closer to you?
It's complicated, as you know, and as Peter said, I think a number of us were just about to launch a Lancet Commission on rethinking misinformation, health, and human security. I think we need to rethink our even calling misinformation because it already polarizes. And the other thing about it is that there's a lot of other tactics that are going on, emotional manipulation that wouldn't be taken down because it's inaccurate. It's harmful. but it's not accurate. And with the new evolutions in AI, fake people, fake voices, fake situations, repurposing things, we have a lot of new work to do. And I think it's the fact checking, pre debunking is it's not gonna fix this, in short.
Yeah. Well, the only thing I would like to add is that I think for those of us who, let's say, in charge of, let's talk now about health and public health. What we do at the moment is maybe reacting and so on, but we need to do two things. One, we need serious budgets to deal with this. At the moment, it's pretty amateurish. This is wrong, and then they make some statement, or that's not going to. We need a professional approach. I mean, it's great that you're doing a PhD on that. We need, and that should be based on the science of it also. But not only the science, but also, let's say, the marketing, and in today's world. And I'm too old for that in a sense, but this the new ways of communication and so on, and preempting it. And when we and it can hit at, for me, sometimes unexpected corners, but there's probably a reason for that. Often, what I've learned from Heidi also, it's about something else. It's not about the vaccine, but about you don't like the government, or this, there was a history of whatever. So I think as long as in, let's now call it public health, we're not taking it as serious as we do with other things, and we don't invest in it, we're gonna lose. And we need to develop strategies against it, because these are pretty sophisticated things. Now, what I've also learned is that it's not only an individual, how to say, who doesn't like this or that. Some of it is very well organized. It's political, it's a force, can be domestic, political, ideological, or it can be foreign powers also. And I think, again, what I find is among health professionals, we're very naive what's going on. And we think, oh, it's some idiot or some, some person who's sending that on TikTok or whatever. And so it should become a science. It reminds me a little bit, completely different, but at London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, we have a group that's working on gender-based violence and so on. And it's until Charlotte Watts came on, who's now at the Wellcome Trust, that she introduced the science of it. It's not enough to write another paper that beating your wife is bad. Okay. No, we need to see what works. And you do trials. You sit, and they found that most of what was recommended didn't work. The key was to focus on the men. It's the men who, kill women and beat women. It's not the women. But so what the reason I'm mentioning that is that for the same reason, I think we need to introduce very strong science in this field. This is what Heidi and our group do, and what you're doing also, and so that there is a basis for that. But at the same time, we need the budgets and all that, and without that, I don't think we have a chance on earth if we don't take it seriously and invest in the budgets.
I'm scanning the room for the next hand. There's one over there.
Thank you so much for the talk tonight. My name is Suzanne Davis, and I'm in the Health Policy Planning and Financing MSc, so jointly at LSHDM and LSE. And before this, I actually worked for the U.S. Treasury Department on global health issues, namely the Pandemic Fund. So thanks for the shout out, even though there's a lot of work to do there. And I was curious, so policymakers often want to see immediate or tangible results, like X shots in arm or X number of HIV infections averted. So how do you recommend communicating the value of health system strengthening investments, which usually take place over a much longer time horizon? And sometimes if they're successful, it just means that, nothing happens because we were able to prevent a disease outbreak or something like that. Thank you.
No, you're putting really, that's a really key issue from in terms of resource allocation and political. Even for domestic health funding also. look at what's going on here with the NHS in this country. I mean, most of the measures are short-term. I happened to read an article that you and others just published in the Lancet. And so instead of the structural reforms that are harder to understand, that maybe in the short run more expensive, etc. For international funding, it's even more difficult because, as you say, you want results, and it's the good news is that these donors want evidence of impact in saving lives and all that, and so that's the good news. But if you take that as a KPI, be too narrow, you may actually undermine the rest. And so that's what is happening. I don't have a solution for it at all. I think the key is that the country in charge, that is there, that they said this is our priority, and we will only. I think you need to, you need, in a sense, you need both. And we will do this, but at the same time, we need to make sure that what we do for disease X, that we strengthen. At the moment, in many countries, there's a tsunami of diabetes, so not of infectious diseases. Now, that's like for HIV, it's chronic treatment. So you need a system that can absorb that chronic condition and all that. So maybe we need to join more forces there. But I don't have an answer. I'm afraid, and I rely on my colleagues here. You're more, and Martin and so on. You've been thinking about it, but I think it's the time has come now that from the side of low and middle income countries, the call is really more for the system strengthening. That is very clear, and I think that's a positive development. But at the same time, we should not neglect. I don't know, you need campaigns against malaria but that should be part of the system. And we also should make sure that the health system and primary care is embedded in the community. And that and often when it comes to prevention, that's not the healthcare system that is the key. I mean, think of we talked about the treaty, the convention with the treaty on tobacco control, that's outside the system. So I'm not trying to duck the question, Joe, but it means that the leadership in the country is so critical, but not all, those donors are ready to it, that's for sure. And it also reflects sometimes the lack of interest in the health system in the donor country. Not because you're a high-income country that you have a good health system that invest in it.
There's another question, guy in the orange and two others in the row in front.
Hi there, my name's Varun Sitaram. I'm an LSE alumnus and actually former student of yours, Ali, some years ago. My question, I now work at the intersection of business, government and civil society. And my question is, in addition to business, government and NGOs, what role do you see for community in combating systemic health issues in the current context and prospective future contexts?
No, I mean, for me, that's very, very clear. And it's perhaps based on my experience of having worked myself in some low-income countries, in Africa particularly, and working on HIV, that you need at the same time a system where people can come, and just going back to AI, for example, self-care and using AI and so on will only be really impactful if that can refer to a system where people can then be treated and so on. So you could have in the community, you could have AI tools and all that, and so, but and that would be already a very important first step. But then the second role of communities is on the prevention side, norms and standards, and anti-discrimination, what have you. So for me, in my own thinking, it's always one entity, and including also the private sector. I mean, you can't say, and that's often the case in public health, we don't want to have anything to do with the private sector. And I always ask, where do you think that the drugs come from? I mean, the medicines and the tools and so on, and and then you have pharmacies and all that, and you can like it or not, but you need to bring that together. But how to do that in a manageable way? And that's why I think the key is foundation is a system that can incorporate all that. But it's at the local level that you have the communities. I mean, there are countries that have been quite successful with community health workers and all that. And in others, it doesn't work. I can't. The big issue is that in big cities, what's a community? But you have sub-communities. I can work on that. I mean, when I was very young, I started a community center with, for this one these days, Turkish immigrants. I was then in Belgium. And so, because the language was important, the culture, sometimes the religion. It's Ramadan, that can mean that you have things in common, and that can stimulate what is at the end of the day going to be as important for healthy life is norms, standards, food habits, and all that. But I think here, digital tools and so on can be as much divisive as bring community together. And I always try to be optimistic. So
There was a person just in front. Then over there. This side's lagging, but yeah, a couple up here. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. My name is Anish. I study international social and public policy here at the LSE. I have two questions, if that's okay. First is that in this sort of fragmented global health landscape, do you think philanthropic entities like, say, the Gates Foundation enjoy too much power? And secondly, with regards to what you said about sort of reframing things in terms of economic and security issues, do you think along those same lines that focusing on the social determinants of health is sort of the way forward here?
Yeah, 2 points. I always like to think of the counterfactual. And in the case of the Gates Foundation, think of a world where the Gates Foundation would not give anything. And so it's about, I don't know the exact figures, but it's billions. I think that would cost lives also. And so I think that the value, it depends what it is about, but I think the advantage of that foundation is being introducing innovation. They're the biggest supporters of Gavi, of Global Fund, where I have where I think we need a discussion is about influence in the WHO, for example. That is a different story. But on the other hand, I think for overall, you've had fantastic contributions in also accelerating new products, the development of new products, and then reducing the price so that it's become accessible and market shaping. And that I think is pretty unique for philanthropy. That's one. On the social determinants, I mean, they're there, there's no doubt about it. But I don't see the point of publishing the 500th article about social determinants or this or that. What I'm interested in, it's about is what do we do? How do we intervene? And what can we influence? Certain things we know education. Okay, you can, education in the past was always about girls. I think now boys are probably a bigger problem for health and for all kinds of things. But so my point is that it's what I mentioned about human rights and so on. I'm interested in action and what to do. And I think that's where the research efforts also, so that's very important. But without ignoring social determinants, then we're naive.
Hi, good night. My name is Mariana. I'm a PhD student at King's College under the Brazil Institute, researching global health, especially the COVID-19 pandemic. My question is that in the past few years, we've seen a call for decolonizing global health, right? And knowing the direct relation of this call with the crisis that we have at hand and that you have discussed tonight, I wonder, how do you see this call? And if you think
how do you think decolonization should look like in the global health field?
Yeah, I mean, I think this precedes the current crisis, this call, and what is happening with initiatives like the Accra Reset, with the initiatives that we discussed, that's decolonization in practice. How will it happen? I mean, and it can be at many levels. It's at the level of a university, a level of an NGO, and so on. It's more and more what's called localization. And for me, it's not just an ideological thing, but it's also we want the best results for people on the ground. And I think this is where the local expertise, the community expertise even, combined with global partnerships, can produce the best result. Because if I've heard talks about decolonization where they would abolish about anything that's going on in this country that will be also costing lives. So we need to go to co-creation, partnerships, and so on in a genuine way. And I think we're going to the right direction. But the question is still, or the issue, where is the money coming from? It is from high-income countries. And so how do you manage that where money is power and that you can have it in a more equal way? And that is, I don't have an answer to it, but I think where there is for me, no doubt about it, is that in today, and I'm thinking about the whole world, when you look at in Asia, what's going on, I mean, in terms of innovation and talent and expertise, you can sometimes wonder, aren't we a bit behind? In Africa, about every single country, with some exceptions, because of their being in permanent conflict, like Somalia, so you have absolute great talent, even some institutions, was associated with the Institut Pasteur in Dakar. Soon they will produce the first yellow fever vaccines and so on. We publish also in, Nature and so on. So that, again, this going on in Brazil, etc. So I think that is different from when I was young and when these institutions were constructed, because their so-called technical support was a big mission, because all the expertise, I mean, in theory, was here. And then, we would assist and build capacity, a term I hate, but anyway, at least we should say strengthen capacity. So there's a big difference, but there's still always a way to go. But the question for me is, how can we change that at the political level and at the global institutions level? And that's going to be a political battle. And it's one step forward, two steps backwards. We see that today.
The question over here.
Hi, I'm Lee. I'm the only person here in uniform, so I'll stand up. I work in UK civil protection. We're tiny. We have no money. Our cousins, however, in the defence and security space are licking their lips with the money that's coming their way in the West. It's not always clear what the money's got to be spent on, but rather they're told the targets. So the question, Peter, is what could be done to kind of divert some of that military defence spending, and those assets into humanitarian disaster relief, genuine development, because it seems they're going to get the money anyhow, and it'd be nice if the money was spent on something a bit better, really.
Yeah, that's a very relevant question for today, I can say. I don't have an answer to it in a sense. First, I should say that I worked quite a lot with peacekeeping operations from the UN and with military. And the reason is that that started in Cambodia after the Khmer Rouge were, defeated, and there were UN peacekeepers operations, and they actually introduced HIV because peacekeeping operation is in a very poor country, what to do, etc., etc. So, but anyway, so we developed programs for to protect the local population, prevent, etc. So this is how I got to know the military a bit better, and I've seen that there is an enormous value, and what we could do is, so that's not answering your question, but I think that they're also part of, in some societies, a very important part. So we need to make sure that that is out there. No, diverting the budgets is a completely political, decision. And I always think that it's a fact of life. So can we learn from it? Can there, you can see, for example, going back to pandemics and epidemics, you can position that as a biosecurity issue, and that there is that could come under the budgets of security. Maybe that, but that's kind of a bit of an opportunistic type of way to do it. But it illustrates again that when there's no peace, everything else suffers. And we're lucky that we're not in Ukraine, or we're not in the Middle East, we're not in Sudan, we're not in Eastern Congo, and so on. So can you imagine what it is there when you start talking there about health? It's I'm not saying irrelevant, but that's not a priority. We need. Sorry, I'm not.
There was well, politics is a whole open question, of course, but there was a question behind.
Hi, my name is Vandana, and I'm a LSE Health Policy alumni and currently a life sciences consultant. And my question is to invite your views on how you see private and public partnerships as a method to promote vaccine uptake. COVID-19 saw the growth of public and private partnerships, namely with pharmaceuticals, to align scientific innovation with public health priorities. And I'm curious to see, based on your experience and your outlook for the future, on where you see these partnerships going with pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, well, in general, I think that partnerships can have value added if it's very clear what you're trying to deliver. But two, also, it depends on the environment. If you have a system where the public sector provides everything, okay, that's there. In many countries, that's not the case. And also what you call private, there are countries where maybe 80% of healthcare is provided by private producers. That can be not necessarily for profit, but so you need to work with them. Absolutely. But if the question is about those who produce vaccines, as I mentioned before, without them, we would not have vaccines. So for me, it's always important to be clear about the expectations and who's providing what and for what purpose. And my ultimate criteria has always been, it has to benefit people, it has to save lives. And then you start from there and go backwards. And if that needs, there are limits. You don't want to deal with some whatever people. But if that's a criteria, then you can see who fits into that. And that's why it can be a community, can be a company, it can be, and let's not forget the public sector.
Time for one more, I think, question before we finish. They're not easy questions, so don't expect easy answers.
Well, I hope my question is easy, hopefully. So my name is Dion. I'm a research officer at LSE Health. So a few months ago, someone from Gavi gave a guest lecture. She said actually volume purchasing at low price was actually not their first choice. Their first option was try to convince pharmaceutical companies to license their technology, their patents to vaccine manufacturers in Africa and other countries. But none of the pharmaceutical companies are willing to do that. So I'm curious what you think of such reluctancy, and also what do you think could be like solutions to, convince the big pharmaceuticals to share their technology with people really in desperate need of them. Also, people probably don't have very high ability to pay.
Yeah, I think you, in a sense, We need both. I mean, Gavi has really made a difference by negotiating this lower price, even with big pharma, let's call it that way. There's no doubt about that for me. Because again, a counterfactual is that if countries would have negotiated directly, they would have paid a much higher price because the volume. That's one thing. Then it all, it's not completely right. Then there are many, the biggest producers of vaccines today are basically in India. I mean, and it's the equivalent of generics. So some vaccines are under a patent still, intellectual property. For example, shingles. But there are some, and it's pretty expensive. But most of the childhood vaccines, and I'm not, except like RSV, the new ones, but all the others, they're produced at very low cost by mostly Indian and some Chinese companies, but mostly Indian. India has become the pharmacy of the world, and the two biggest ones are the Serum Institute and Biological E, but then in Indonesia is coming up also. So I think I'm not so for childhood vaccines. I think it'll be very difficult to reduce further the price and the cost of goods. There is a whole movement for vaccine production in manufacturing in Africa. Ironically, I mean, as much as I'm passionate about local manufacturing, it is we're starting with the most difficult product, and that's vaccines. But now in hopefully next month or maybe May, in Nigeria for the first time, dual bed nets. So these are bed nets against malaria, and that have two products so that protect against mosquitoes, will be produced in Nigeria. The 95% of the market for these dual bed nets is in Africa. 0 bed nets have up to now been produced. And it's through a partnership between a company in Switzerland, Westergaard, and a Nigerian company, and they're starting now. And so that's much, I mean, it's machines, and so, I mean, I don't know the technical details, but I imagine it's much easier than vaccine. So there are, and that will then create some local capacity and jobs and so on. And you can have for diagnostics and for small molecules and so on. So that's what the future is. But for childhood vaccines, it will be very difficult to do better. But it is the new vaccines, and there are some pneumococcal vaccines or HPV that have many serotypes and so on. That's where, and I think that's something where going back to the Gates Foundation, the Gates Foundation is very much involved in bringing down the price of that, and through partnerships with some local manufacturers. But it is a problem for some, that's for sure. And how to resolve that, that's a huge question for not only for vaccines. I mean, it's actually, I think, a much bigger question for some products. I mean, look at GLP-1 antagonists at the moment. They're, whether you like them or not, but they have a big impact. No patent of some of them will expire soon. So we'll see a flurry of like every single Chinese and Indian generic manufacturing is preparing for it. That's going to be fierce competition among themselves. But it may get, at some point, I can see, particularly when we have oral GLP-1 products, generic ones, that it may be the price of statins at some point. It's not for tomorrow, but look into the future.
So look, I hope you've all enjoyed Peter's extensive experience, which he's drawn on, and also his enthusiasm. And he is, dare I say, it's a modest guy, and he's only promoted his book once. So if you want to learn more, he's got two.
Between science and politics.
Well, having skimmed through this one, I thought it's a good read, and it does build off his experience, and it motivates you, as I think he has in his talk tonight. Hopefully, motivated you to kind of get out there and do things after you've left academia. Not that academics don't do things, but he's done much more. Okay, thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.